It's time for President Biden to do whatever is necessary to bring down oil prices. And guess what? There's something he can do, but he's choosing not to. Let's talk about it in today's video. Hi, I'm Mike Greiner. I'm a lifelong Democratic activist who's concerned about the direction our country is taking. I'm also a lawyer and an academic, and I'm here to help you stand up to the BS of the MAGA crowd. So, a recent article pointed out that high California gas prices rattled Democrats ahead of midterms. We have to be worried here. We've got some big problems. People are angry about inflation and about gas prices. Now, I know people run around talking about the fact that the president can't control gas prices and neither can the Democrats, but it doesn't matter. People are mad about them. I also know it's not Joe Biden's fault that gas prices have gone up. I mean, he did not cause the Russian invasion of Ukraine, which is probably the biggest factor in increasing gas prices. And he certainly wasn't responsible for the crash in gas prices back in 2020 as a result of the pandemic, which resulted in the American oil companies cutting back on production. But none of that matters. People are mad, and they're going to take it out on the Democrats at the ballot box. Now, I'm actually cautiously optimistic that we're going to make progress on a couple issues that should benefit the Democrats before the general election in November. On inflation, we can see that the Fed is taking it very seriously and is moving very aggressively to curb inflation. Interest rates on mortgages have risen quite a bit, and it's quite clear that although the jobs market continues to be strong, inflation has been slowing according to a number of indicators. So that's good news. If people can feel that inflation is really meaningfully slowed before the general election comes, I think that won't be an issue anymore for the Democrats. If anything, it could turn into a positive, given the fact that President Biden can say, hey, we handled it. Similarly, I think that by the general election, we're going to see some real progress in Ukraine, where it will be evident that President Biden's leadership there has helped the Ukrainians defend their country and push Russia back from their ill-conceived invasion of Ukraine. This will be another thing that the president, his allies, and the Democrats will be able to point to as a sign of success of this administration. I mean, it's true. I look back on the Trump administration where basically he went through almost 4 years of his presidency with no crises that he didn't create himself. He had a great economy that he had nothing to do with. He had low inflation. He had low gas prices. None of those things had anything to do with them. In fact, if anything, the person who was probably most responsible for them was Barack Obama. It took the COVID crisis to finally create some crisis that Trump did not create himself, and it just shows how ill-equipped he was to be president, given how completely he flubbed that responsibility. Contrast that with President Biden, who came in the midst of a recession. He was able to get money in people's pockets and help the economy recover quickly. He was able to get shots in people's arms and bring the COVID rate way down. Is it possible that the efforts of Biden and the Democrats to help people survive the pandemic crisis might have led to the current spate of inflation that we're dealing with now? That's certainly possible. But there had to be a choice made. Were we going to allow kind of the slow recovery from the recession that had been characteristic of our recoveries from recession? I mean, look at what happened after 2008, how long it took for us to get back to normal times. Or were we going to risk overheating the economy just to make sure that everybody could survive and get back to work as quickly as possible? There, I think President Biden made the right choice. That being said, as a result of it, there is inflation that now the Fed is dealing with. But certainly, Biden had nothing to do with the Russians invading Ukraine. He had nothing to do with the impact of that invasion on both food prices and oil prices. And for that matter, he had nothing to do with the baby formula crisis that now seems to finally be resolving itself. It just shows the contrast here, where you had one president who basically had nothing bad happen to him, and then finally when something bad happened to him, he completely flubbed it. And you have another president who has been dealing with one crisis after another, after another, after another, and has dealt with it remarkably well. But the one exception to that are oil prices, where Biden, again, to be fair, doesn't really have a lot of control of it. And I can see where the Democrats are pointing fingers at the oil companies, talking about how they're engaging in profiteering as a result of these high prices. I mean, I hate the oil companies too. Believe me, I hate them almost as much as I hate insurance companies and banks, two of my least favorite kinds of industries, and both industries that have thrown the United States into prior recessions. But when it comes to the oil companies here, you know, their defenders actually have kind of a point. Profiteering, or what we economists call rent extraction, occurs when a company has enough control of their industry that they're basically able to set their own prices and make sure that they make profits. That's not what we see going on here. Oil companies, unlike, for example, Amazon.com, are what are called price takers rather than price makers. What that means is that the global market, an open market, sets the price of oil, and they kind of have to deal with whatever the price is. Now, yes, right now they're making a lot of money as a result of the high price of oil. But that being said, they also lost a boatload of money, something to the tune of $76 billion during the crash in 2020. So it's kind of one of those examples. This is a pure market where you kind of take the good with the bad. And you can see where the oil companies are a little bit gun-shy of investing in more exploration and more production, given the fact that they were producing much more, and oil prices had come down, and then they crashed in 2020. And as a result of that, as I said earlier, they lost a ton of money. Now, that being said, the question is then, what can be done to bring down oil prices? Well, it's clear what needs to happen is we need more oil. Now, I'm an environmentalist too, and I would like to see us shifting off of fossil fuels, but the reality here is that if Democrats get killed in the next midterm election, you may as well kiss any hope we have of dealing with climate change goodbye. I mean, I just saw a report about how the United States got thrown totally off of the track that we were on to deal with climate change as a result of the efforts of the Trump administration. President Biden, to his credit, has been trying to get us back on track, but he's got a long way to go given how much damage the Trump administration did. That's what we're facing if the Republicans take control of Congress in the next election. So we need to look at the big picture here. So how do we get more oil onto the open market? Well, one way is what President Biden has already done, which is releasing oil from the Strategic Petroleum Reserve. The problem is these releases, even though they're big, they're tiny compared to the total amount of oil and total amount of demand in this global market for oil. And they certainly can't replace the amount of oil that has been taken out of the market as a result of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. OPEC, for their part, have certainly not been helping, where they've been trying to keep the price of oil high. But as it turns out, most of the members of OPEC can't pump any more oil anyway. The one exception to that is Saudi Arabia. And guess what? President Biden, after at one point saying that he wanted to totally isolate Saudi Arabia as a result of their assassination of journalist Jamal Khashoggi, is now going to Saudi Arabia to try to get them to pump more oil. And it appears that they're totally willing to do that because they want to reestablish their relationship to the United States. But as an article in the New York Times pointed out, and I'll link to that article down below as I always do, even if we get Saudi Arabia to pump more oil, it's probably not able to pump enough oil to replace all the losses that have occurred as a result of the Russian invasion and the increased demand that's going on right now in China as a result of them reopening. Well, as it turns out, there are two places we can get more oil from. Those are Venezuela and Iran. So let's talk about those. Venezuela, interesting enough, still has a relationship with Chevron, the American oil company. And Chevron has said that they could relatively quickly, within a month or two, start pumping enough oil to essentially replace all the oil that has been taken off the market as a result of the Russian invasion. The Venezuelan president, Nicolas Maduro, is no superstar, and that's why we have sanctions against Venezuela, which have basically crippled its oil industry. But Chevron's presence there would allow us to basically quickly get at least some production up to speed. And frankly, there are some side effects too that could be benefits, which are buying more Venezuelan oil would probably reduce some of the suffering that the Venezuelan people have been experiencing as a result of the crash of their economy and the sanctions they've been suffering through. Maduro, though, is a true authoritarian, and as a result, he's a bad guy. And we've put him on the bad guy list. But guess what? We've done business with bad guys before to get oil. The classic case, of course, is Saudi Arabia. I mean, Saudi Arabia's crown prince, Mohammed bin Salman Al Saud, also known as MBS, is basically a murderer who basically gave billions of dollars to Donald Trump's son-in-law to try to essentially curry favor with the United States. I mean, this is not a good guy. And even though he's made steps to seem progressive by giving women some more rights than they've traditionally had in Saudi Arabia, the guy is nothing more than an authoritarian dictator, and yet he's got oil, so we're willing to go to him and do business with him. So why aren't we willing to do business with Venezuela? Similarly, in Iran, we have an opportunity to add an enormous amount of oil to the global market. Iran, however, as we know, has been isolated by the United States since the early 1980s. Ever since, as part of the Iranian Revolution, they basically took over the American embassy there. During the Obama administration, though, we actually negotiated a deal with Iran, which would have, at least for a period, made it so that they wouldn't have been enriching uranium with the aim of being able to get nuclear weapons. Now, I've made other videos about that, and I'll link to it at the end. But it appeared that actually a deal had pretty much been reached in Vienna with Iran to reestablish this deal. And it would basically stop the Iranians from getting a nuclear weapon, which I gotta tell you is a pretty good idea as far as I'm concerned. During the Trump administration, as you know, he engaged in a campaign of maximum pressure, which frankly did nothing. He took us out of the nuclear deal, reimposed sanctions, and then even added sanctions to it. Like, for example, adding the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps to the list of state sponsors of terrorism. Now, I'm not defending the IRGC. They're bad guys. I mean, they've been involved in all kinds of terrorist activity in Yemen, where there's basically a war going on. But as it turns out, guess who's the other state who's involved in the Yemen war? That would be Saudi Arabia, the other country that we're doing business with. Well, as it turns out, this listing of IRGC as a terrorist organization is largely symbolic because Iran overall has been named a state sponsor of terrorism since the mid-1980s. So putting them on this list and taking them off this list would be purely symbolic. And from everything I've read, if Biden were to agree to take the IRGC off the terrorist list, that would probably be the final stumbling block being taken out of the way to finalizing a deal here. Again, making it so that both Iran would not be getting any nuclear weapons, one, and number two, they'd be producing oil, which we need right now. So what's stopping President Biden from doing deals with Iran and Venezuela, which would release the kind of oil onto the global market that would bring oil prices down in a meaningful way? Well, it's basically political pressure. I mean, the one country in the world that has basically opposed the Iran nuclear deal from day one is Israel. And they imposed upon the Trump administration to oppose it, and they've kind of got some close alliances with the Republican right wing, as well as many Democrats, who have raised concerns about the Iran nuclear deal. But even in Israel, there's been a recognition of the fact that, in some respects, it's a good deal because of the fact that they don't want Iran to get nuclear weapons any more than we do. That being said, the Israeli Prime Minister, Naftali Bennett, has been pushing for the U.S. not to take the IRGC off the terrorist watch list. And similarly, the Senate passed a non-binding resolution urging the administration not to take them off the watch list. Similarly, there's been all kinds of noise about Venezuela and how Maduro needs to make some types of concessions before the United States starts to give it some relief from the sanctions there. But it's important to note, Venezuela hasn't invaded anybody. All Venezuela has done is basically install an authoritarian regime that we don't like. Kind of like what we've seen in Saudi Arabia, who we're doing business with. Now, I've long been frustrated with the fact that the United States, as a result of our dependence on oil, often ends up kind of having a black hat when it comes to international affairs. But the reality is that if we go into this next election with oil prices the way they are, the Republicans are going to win, and we're going to see big problems. I mean, what happens if another seat on the U.S. Supreme Court opens up? Do you think they'll let Biden appoint somebody to it? I don't think so. Do you think that they'll allow President Biden to make any progress with climate change? I don't think so. And Mitch McConnell has made it clear he won't even let Biden appoint the cabinet officials he wants to help run the government. This could be chaos. And if you were thinking the Republicans were causing trouble now when they're in the minority in both houses in Congress, just wait until they have a majority position somewhere. What's more is if the Democrats are able to win and maybe even pick up a couple seats in the Senate, we could accomplish some of the things that we've been hoping to do. Things like trying to reform our voting laws, addressing climate change, taxing the rich, addressing inequality, maybe even passing a real Build Back Better bill, the kind that has passed the House and that 48 out of 50 Democratic senators support. But we can kiss all that goodbye if we allow the oil prices to dominate the discussion coming up to the next election. It's time for the Biden administration to wake up to reality here and take some serious action. And if it means us having to swallow a little bit of criticism from some people who don't like the fact that we're doing business with some bad guys in the world, well, guess what? We're already doing business with some bad guys in the world, and for oil. They may as well just join the group. Well, if you want to see some of the history about the negotiations over the Iran nuclear deal, why don't you check out this video over here that I did a little while ago. It would really be a tragedy if we allow this opportunity to stop Iran from getting nuclear weapons to really go by the wayside. I'll see you then. In the meantime, let's hope for continued progress. Thank you.